He was the saddest billionaire anyone could imagine. Elliot Rivers sat alone in the finest restaurant in the city. His plate of food lay cold, untouched, while his glass of wine barely reached the halfway mark. He had everything anyone could ever want, but none of it made him happy. Not anymore. Elliot had made his millions through ruthless business deals, climbing to the top of the corporate ladder. He owned empires, properties, and endless wealth. But now, the only thing he seemed to own was his solitude, and no amount of money, no lavish dinner, no fine wine could fill the emptiness inside him. As he sat there, staring at his food, a voice broke through the silence. "Excuse me, sir." Elliot looked up, startled. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, stood in front of his table. Her dress was too big for her tiny frame, and her hair was tied in tight braids. She didn't look at him with awe or fear. No, her eyes held something different. Curiosity, unfiltered honesty. He blinked, confused. What was this child doing here? Why was she speaking to him? She didn't hesitate. She spoke again, her voice clear and loud in the otherwise quiet room. "You look like the saddest rich man I've ever seen." Elliot was taken aback. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His throat felt tight. He was silent. He had been silent for years, ever since the accident, ever since the world had taken his voice away. He quickly grabbed his notepad, the one he always carried with him for moments like this when his voice failed him, and scribbled a note. "Excuse me." He showed the note to her, unsure of how to respond. The little girl didn't hesitate. She just looked at the paper and then looked back at him with an intense gaze. "I said," she signed with her hands, "you look really sad. And you're wearing a watch that probably cost more than my mama's car. So that makes you a sad rich man." Elliot stared at her, his mind racing. This little girl was speaking to him like no one had in years. There was no awkwardness in her voice, no pity in her eyes. She wasn't scared of him. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was just honest. And somehow that honesty cut through the walls Elliot had built around himself. His heart twisted. He had never been spoken to like this before. He had become so used to people avoiding him, pretending not to notice the silence that surrounded him. But this girl, this little stranger, saw right through him, and she wasn't afraid to speak the truth. He reached for his pen again, his hand trembling slightly. He quickly wrote down, "Why do you think I'm sad?" Amara took a moment to look at the note, and then she spoke again, unbothered by the attention she was drawing from the other diners. "Don't you have anyone to eat with?" Her words stung. She wasn't wrong. He didn't have anyone to eat with. Not anymore. Not since everything changed. Elliot leaned back in his chair, a sigh escaping his lips. He didn't know what to say. The little girl was right. She had cut through the facade that he had been hiding behind for years. The silence between them grew, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time in years, Elliot felt a strange sense of connection. Here was this young girl, so fearless, so unapologetic, breaking through his walls in a way no one had ever done before. She wasn't treating him like a fragile billionaire. She wasn't trying to sell him anything. She was simply there, speaking to him as a person. Not as a client, not as a figure to admire, but as someone who could listen to her words and understand them. "Please leave me alone. I'm eating." Elliot scribbled on his notepad once more, handing it to her. He didn't want to admit it, but something in her words, in her presence, made him feel things he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't used to people speaking to him so openly, without fear or hesitation. The little girl read the note, scrunched her nose, and shook her head. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. She sat down at the table across from him, uninvited, and started eating a breadstick, as if she had been given a place at his table long ago. "That's kind of rude," she said, not caring about the awkwardness. "My mama says people who eat alone all the time start to smell like silence." Elliot's heart clenched. Her words were so blunt, yet so true. The silence that had filled his life for so long now felt suffocating. It wasn't just his voice that had been taken away in the accident. It was everything. His connection to the world had disappeared. This little girl, this stranger, had somehow cracked open the shell he had built around himself. Before we get back in, let us know where you are watching from today. If you're enjoying this story, hit the subscribe button now. For the first time in a long time, Elliot didn't feel completely alone. He wasn't sure what had changed, whether it was her words or the simple fact that she hadn't treated him like everyone else had. But something inside him shifted. "You're not supposed to be here," he wrote on his notepad, the words feeling strange on the page. But Amara didn't care. She just smiled at him, chewing her breadstick with a carefree look on her face. "I know," she said, "but I'm here anyway." Elliot's gaze softened. She was right. She was here. And for the first time in years, someone had truly seen him, not for his wealth or his business deals, but for who he was, an empty man, starving for connection. Amara finished her breadstick, gave him a smile, and stood up to leave. "I'll see you next week, okay? Maybe we can talk some more." Elliot watched her walk away, her small form disappearing into the crowd. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt something so pure. For the first time in years, Elliot didn't feel like a lonely billionaire. He felt like a man who had been seen, truly seen, by someone who had nothing to gain from it. It had been a week since Amara had appeared at his table, and Elliot couldn't get her out of his mind. The words she had spoken, the honesty in her eyes, had unsettled him in a way he didn't expect. For the first time in years, he felt a strange kind of warmth. The cold, solitary dinners that had once been routine now felt different. He found himself thinking about Amara every time he sat alone at his table. Every time the silence wrapped around him like a heavy cloak, he remembered her words. People who eat alone all the time start to smell like silence. Elliot had never paid much attention to his silence. He had learned to live with it, to embrace it, as a shield, a way to protect himself from the world. But now her words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront the reality he had been avoiding for so long. He arrived early at the restaurant that evening, as he had done every Thursday for the past few months. But tonight, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. He hadn't planned it, but a part of him had hoped to see Amara again, to somehow fix the broken pieces of conversation they'd shared last week. As the minutes ticked by, Elliot sat at his usual table, waiting for the familiar yet uncomfortable stillness to take over. The waitstaff went about their business, unaware of the shift happening within him. Then, almost like a sign from fate, the door to the restaurant opened, and there she was. Amara. She entered, holding her small sketchbook like a prized possession, her mother, Lena, trailing behind her, looking cautious but not as protective as the last time. Amara's eyes immediately scanned the room, and as soon as she spotted Elliot, she grinned and made her way toward him, dragging her mother along like they were old friends. Elliot didn't know whether to be relieved or startled, but he stood up anyway, not entirely sure why. He hadn't expected her to return. She had been a brief encounter, a stranger who had cut through his silence, but here she was again, as if she had something more to say. Lena looked uneasy, her eyes flicking nervously between her daughter and Elliot. She was protective, as mothers often are, and she didn't quite trust the stranger sitting at the table. She had every right to feel that way. After all, Elliot was a man of wealth and power, someone who seemed unreachable, someone who didn't belong in the same world as a little girl like Amara. But Amara wasn't afraid of him. Amara wasn't afraid of anyone. "Amara," Lena said softly, though her voice carried a trace of authority, "you're not supposed to bother the customers." But before Amara could respond, Elliot raised his hand to stop her, looking at Lena with an expression that conveyed something unfamiliar, an understanding, maybe even a plea for her to let the moment unfold. "She's fine," Elliot signed quickly, though his words felt strange on his lips. For the first time in a long time, he didn't want to shut her out. He wanted to hear what she had to say. Lena hesitated, but then she sighed and gave a reluctant nod, signaling to Amara that it was okay to sit. She took a step back, crossing her arms and watching from the periphery. Amara sat down, as though she had been invited, as though she belonged there. She placed her sketchbook on the table and looked up at Elliot, her gaze steady. "I brought you something," she said, her small hands flipping through the pages of her sketchbook until she found what she was looking for. She pulled out a drawing of a sad-looking man, sitting alone at a dinner table. His shoulders were slumped, his face downcast. "This is you," she said, showing the picture to him. Elliot stared at the drawing, his heart sinking. There it was again, the blunt honesty of her observation. She had captured his loneliness in a way he couldn't ignore. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words were stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say? Amara wasn't finished. She flipped to the next page, showing him a new drawing. This time, the man at the table had a small smile on his face. And in the corner of the page, there was a single flower. "This is what I think you might look like if you had a friend," she said, matter-of-factly, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Elliot blinked, struck by her words. Had he really been that invisible to the world? That unseen? Or was it possible that in the simplicity of a child's perspective, he could finally begin to see himself? Amara's words hung in the air like a weight. For the first time in ages, Elliot felt something stir within him, something long forgotten. Was it hope? Was it the realization that maybe he wasn't beyond repair? "You look like you have a lot of feelings," Amara said, her voice soft but firm, "but nobody asks you about them." Elliot sat there, absorbing her words. She had no idea how true they were. His life had become a series of business transactions, meetings, and presentations. But never, not once, had anyone asked about him. Not since the accident. Not since he had lost his voice. Amara was right. He had been surrounded by people his entire life, but none of them had ever really seen him. They saw his wealth, his power, his success, but none of them saw the man he had become after the accident, the man who had learned to live in silence. Lena watched the exchange from a distance, her arms still crossed, but her expression had softened. She didn't fully understand what was happening here, but she could see something in Elliot that hadn't been there before. She stepped forward hesitantly. "Amara, honey, it's time to go," she said gently, her voice still firm but less harsh than it had been earlier. Amara turned her head toward her mother, a frown on her face. "Do we have to?" she asked, as if she had all the time in the world. Elliot could feel the weight of her gaze on him. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and in that moment, Elliot realized something. He wasn't as alone as he had always believed. As Lena gently took Amara by the hand, ready to leave, Amara turned back to Elliot and said with a smile, "Maybe I'll draw you again next week. You can tell me if I'm right." And with that, they were gone. Elliot sat at the table staring at the spot where they had been. His mind raced. He hadn't expected this. A little girl who had nothing to gain from him had turned his world upside down. And for the first time in years, Elliot didn't feel so isolated. Maybe, just maybe, this little girl was the one who could help him find his way back. The following Thursday, Elliot arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. He had spent the entire week thinking about Amara, replaying their conversation over and over in his mind. Her words had stayed with him, cutting through the silence in his life like a knife. "You look really sad. And you're wearing a watch that probably cost more than my mama's car, so that makes you a sad rich man." He couldn't escape the truth in her words. For years, he had been hiding from the pain of his past, pretending that money and success could fill the void inside him. But now he realized all the wealth in the world couldn't fix what was broken inside of him. For the first time, he wanted to change. He didn't want to live in silence anymore. He didn't want to sit at the table pretending to be content while his soul withered away. Elliot sat at his usual corner table, his eyes scanning the room, waiting. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but something inside him told him that tonight would be different. There was an energy in the air that he couldn't explain. Maybe it was because of Amara's promise to return, or maybe it was because for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something to look forward to. The restaurant buzzed with the sounds of clinking glasses and the soft murmur of conversations. But Elliot felt disconnected from it all. The world around him seemed to be moving at a different pace, one that didn't match his own. He stared at the door, hoping for a glimpse of the girl who had changed his perspective on life. Then, just as he had almost convinced himself that she wouldn't come, he saw her, Amara. She walked into the restaurant with her small sketchbook in hand, her bright eyes scanning the room. She was wearing the same oversized dress from last week, and once again she had a confident, carefree air about her. Behind her, Lena followed, looking more guarded than the last time. But there was something different about her this time too. Maybe it was the way she looked at Amara, or the way her eyes softened when she saw Elliot. It was as if she too could sense the change in the air. As soon as Amara spotted Elliot, she made her way toward him, her small legs moving quickly, her sketchbook clutched tightly in her hands. Lena hesitated, watching for a moment, before following her daughter at a slower pace, her eyes flicking nervously between the two. Amara approached the table, her face lighting up with a wide grin. "Hi, Elliot," she said, her voice carrying through the room with unshakable confidence. Elliot felt a strange sense of warmth in his chest. Her simple greeting, so full of life and joy, was the first genuine interaction he had experienced in weeks. He stood up to greet her, his heart racing as he felt the weight of her gaze on him. "I brought you something," Amara said, her eyes sparkling as she pulled out her sketchbook. She flipped through the pages with the care of an artist, finally stopping at a picture of a man sitting alone at a table. At this time there was a small smile on his face. "This is you," she said, pointing at the drawing with a proud expression. "See? You're smiling." Lena stood off to the side, her arms crossed as she watched the exchange. She wasn't sure what to make of the situation. Amara had always been bold, but this was different. She was speaking to a man who was a complete stranger to them, a billionaire, no less. Lena's protective instincts kicked in. "Amara, you can't just," she began, but Amara interrupted her with a wave of her hand. "It's fine, Mama," she said, not looking at her mother. "Elliot's not scary. He's just sad, and maybe I can fix that." Lena frowned, her face softening slightly. She didn't quite understand the connection between her daughter and this man, but she couldn't deny that something about this strange encounter felt important. Elliot couldn't help but smile at Amara's words. She wasn't trying to fix him. Not really. She was simply offering him the gift of her honesty, her presence, and for the first time in a long time it felt like enough. Amara sat down across from him without asking, her small legs swinging under the table as she continued to flip through her sketchbook. She seemed at ease, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. She didn't see a lonely billionaire. She saw a person who needed a friend. "I brought you a present," Amara said with a grin, pulling out a drawing of a tree with a swing hanging from one of its branches. "This is for you. It's a happy tree." Elliot laughed softly, taking the drawing from her hands. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of connection. Amara wasn't just drawing him pictures, she was offering him a piece of herself. Lena watched the two of them from a distance, her arms uncrossing as she observed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. She didn't fully understand it, but she could see that something was happening between Amara and Elliot. Something real. "You're not what I thought you were," Lena said quietly, as she approached the table, her voice softer now. "You're not like all the other people who come and go in her life." Elliot looked up at her, his heart racing. He didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to people being so direct with him, so unafraid to speak their minds. But Lena wasn't judging him. She wasn't asking for anything. She was simply acknowledging the change she saw in her daughter, and perhaps in Elliot as well. The night went on, and the conversation flowed more easily than Elliot expected. Amara's presence had a strange effect on him. Her honesty, her light, made the world seem a little less lonely, a little less cold. As the meal came to a close, Elliot found himself wishing the night could go on forever. He didn't want to go back to his empty penthouse, to the world that had felt so distant and uninviting. He wanted to stay here, in this moment, with Amara and Lena. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something real, something that mattered. Amara stood up to leave, but not before giving him one last smile. "I'll see you next week, right? I'll bring more drawings." Elliot couldn't help but laugh, his heart light with the promise of something new. He nodded slowly, unsure of what the future held, but certain that for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it. As Amara and Lena left the restaurant, Elliot sat back in his chair, still holding the drawing of the happy tree. He felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Could this little girl really change him? Could she help him rediscover what it meant to be human? He didn't have all the answers, but something had shifted. And maybe, just maybe, this little girl was the key to the change he so desperately needed. The week had passed slowly for Elliot. Each day felt like a quiet repetition of the last, but his mind kept returning to the conversation he'd shared with Amara. It wasn't just the drawings or the simple truth in her words. It was the way she had looked at him, the way she had seen him as more than just a billionaire. He found himself staring out the window of his penthouse apartment, the city lights below casting a glow across his thoughts. He had everything he could ever want: money, success, control, but none of it felt meaningful anymore. He had built his life around a foundation of solitude, but now that foundation was beginning to crack. He hadn't realized just how lonely he was until Amara had come into his life. Now, with every passing day, he longed for more of the connection she had given him, something that wasn't about wealth or status or expectations. He was no longer sure of who he was, or who he wanted to be. It was Thursday again, and Elliot found himself pacing around his apartment as the time approached for him to meet Amara. He wasn't sure what had come over him. Normally he would have been preparing for a business meeting, checking emails, or reviewing documents. But today his mind was entirely focused on a little girl with a sketchbook and a confidence that unsettled him in the most curious way. For the first time in a long time he felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty. What would he say to her today? Would she notice that something was changing inside him? When he finally arrived at the restaurant, he was a little early, just like always. He chose his usual table, but tonight he felt a strange sense of anticipation. There was something about the energy in the air, something he couldn't explain. His eyes flicked to the door every time it opened, waiting for Amara and Lena to walk in. As he sat at the table staring into his glass of water, a soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Excuse me, Elliot." He looked up to see Amara standing there, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, and a serious expression on her face. Lena was behind her, watching the interaction with an unreadable expression. Amara didn't hesitate. "I brought you something," she said, walking up to the table and placing the sketchbook in front of him. Elliot took the book from her, feeling the weight of her words. There was a shift in the air between them, a quiet understanding that wasn't there before. He looked at her carefully, studying her face as though searching for something in her expression. She had come here with no agenda, no expectations. She was simply offering something, an opportunity to connect, share something that was hers. He opened the sketchbook, flipping through the pages slowly. Each drawing was more intricate than the last, but it wasn't the artistry that struck him. It was the subject matter. The drawings were full of trees, flowers and animals, all drawn with a quiet joy. But there was one drawing in particular that made his heart stutter. It was a picture of a man sitting at a dinner table, smiling. Elliot was the man in the drawing, and the smile on his face was genuine, not forced or fake, but a real smile, the kind he hadn't seen in years, the kind he didn't know if he could ever feel again. Lena stepped forward cautiously, as if she could sense the depth of the moment. She had always been protective of Amara, but tonight, there was a softness in her approach that wasn't there before. "You know," Lena said quietly, "Amara doesn't always draw like this. She's usually so careful, so reserved with her art. But when she drew this picture, I could get it meant something to her." Elliot didn't know what to say. He had never been good at expressing his emotions. He had always relied on actions, on results. But now, in front of these two people, words didn't seem enough. The drawing in front of him spoke louder than any speech he could make. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly, glancing between Amara and Lena. "You've done something I didn't think was possible." Lena looked at him, her eyes softening, as if she were seeing him for the first time. "You don't have to thank us, Elliot. Amara's just doing what she does best, offering her truth. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything." Elliot felt the weight of her words sink in. She was right. It wasn't about the money, or the status, or even the success. It was about being seen, being heard, and connecting with someone who didn't need anything from him except his honesty. As the night went on, Amara and Elliot spoke more, their conversation flowing easily as they shared stories and thoughts. There was something magnetic about the way Amara spoke. She didn't hold back, didn't filter herself. She simply said what was on her mind. Elliot found himself laughing at her unfiltered observations, at the way she didn't shy away from pointing out the things others were too afraid to say. For the first time in a long time he felt at ease, as though the walls he had built around himself were slowly crumbling away. But even as he laughed, he couldn't shake the feeling that Amara was teaching him something about life, about himself that he had long forgotten. "I think you've been hiding for too long," Amara said suddenly, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that took him by surprise. "You've been hiding from people, from the world. But you don't have to. You don't have to be alone anymore." Her words were like a punch to the gut, but it wasn't painful. It was liberating. For the first time, Elliot saw the truth of what she was saying. He had spent so long in the silence, convincing himself that he was better off alone, that he didn't need anyone. But Amara was showing him that he was wrong. He needed people, even if it was just her, this little girl who saw right through him. As the night wound down, Amara and Lena stood up to leave. Amara turned to Elliot, her eyes serious as she spoke again. "I think you're starting to get it," she said, her voice quiet but filled with certainty. "But you have to trust people, Elliot. You have to trust that they won't hurt you." Elliot didn't know what to say. He had spent so long building walls around himself that the idea of trusting someone, anyone, seemed impossible. But Amara was right. Trusting people was the key to moving forward. It was the only way to break free from the isolation he had created for himself. "I'll try," Elliot whispered, his voice filled with the weight of the promise. He wasn't sure how it would look or when it would happen, but he knew one thing for certain. He was willing to take that first step. As Amara and Lena left the restaurant, Elliot watched them walk away, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Could he really change? Could he really let go of the silence that had held her captive for so long? The week after, Elliot sat at his desk staring at the reports in front of him, but none of the words made sense. His mind kept drifting back to last week, to Amara, to the quiet shift that had happened in him since their conversation. He had gone through the motions of his usual business routine, meetings, calls, negotiations. But everything felt hollow now. He had spent so many years building an empire, focusing only on wealth and power, and yet, none of that had brought him peace. None of it had given him what he had been missing. Amara had opened his eyes to the truth, that human connection, real and genuine, was what truly mattered. He had always assumed that being at the top meant doing everything alone, but Amara's simple honesty had shown him a different way, a way to live not in isolation, but with others, sharing and being seen. The following Thursday, Elliot found himself arriving at the restaurant earlier than usual. There was an excitement in the air, a feeling that today was going to be different. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a sense of anticipation as he made his way to his usual table. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe a continued conversation with Amara, maybe just another quiet evening of reflection. But one thing was certain. He was no longer the man who had walked into this restaurant so many weeks ago, distant and broken. Elliot was no longer just a billionaire. He was someone learning to live again. As the door to the restaurant opened, Elliot's heart skipped a beat. There they were, Amara and Lena, just as they had always been. Amara walked in first, her eyes scanning the room before landing on him, her face lit up with the same unfiltered joy that had drawn him to her in the first place. Lena followed behind, though this time, she didn't seem as cautious. She walked toward the table with a calm that Elliot hadn't seen before. She was no longer worried about whether her daughter was too bold, too fearless. Amara grinned widely when she saw Elliot walking toward him as though she had all the time in the world. "Hi, Elliot," she called, her voice warm and inviting. She sat down across from him without waiting for an invitation. Her presence, once again, felt like a breath of fresh air in a room that had grown stagnant for far too long. Lena smiled and gave a nod of acknowledgement, but there was a subtle shift in her expression. She wasn't looking at him with suspicion anymore. There was understanding in her eyes now. Amara pulled out her sketchbook, her hands moving quickly as she flipped through the pages. She had a new drawing for him, something different from what she had shown him before. This time the picture wasn't of a tree or a person, but of a simple street scene, two people walking side by side, smiling. "This is us," Amara said, holding out the drawing for him to see. "You and me, walking together." Elliot's heart ached as he looked at the drawing. The simplicity of it, the warmth that radiated from the picture. It was as if Amara had captured exactly what he had been missing for all these years. She wasn't drawing him as a billionaire. She wasn't drawing him as someone important. She was drawing him as a person worthy of connection, of friendship. Lena looked at him, her eyes soft. She seemed to sense the shift in him as well. The man she had once seen as a stranger, someone who had nothing in common with her daughter, was now someone different, someone changed. "You know," Lena said quietly, "I never thought I'd see the day when I'd see my daughter bring someone like you out of their shell." Elliot looked at her, unsure of what to say. But the words came to him easily this time, without hesitation. "I didn't know I was hiding," he said softly. "I thought I was just living my life. But now, I see that I was shutting myself off from everything, from the people who could truly make a difference in my life." Lena smiled. A soft, knowing smile. "You're not alone, Elliot. You never were. It's just that sometimes, we need someone to remind us of that." The evening unfolded easily, the conversation flowing more naturally than it ever had before. Amara talked about her school, her favorite games, and the things she loved to draw. Elliot found himself listening more intently than he had ever listened before, not just to her words, but to the rhythm of her voice, the innocence that infused everything she said. For the first time he felt a true connection, not because of his wealth, not because of his status, but because of the raw honesty she offered so freely. And as the night went on, Elliot realized that he wasn't just talking with Amara anymore. He was talking with someone who understood him, someone who saw him for who he really was. Not the billionaire who had it all, but the man who had lost everything and was now learning how to live again. The more Elliot listened, the more he felt a new sense of clarity. He had spent so many years focused on the wrong things, his business, his empire, the image he had created for himself. But here, in this small corner of the restaurant, he realized that those things didn't define him. What defined him was his ability to trust, to connect, to open his heart again. Amara's words echoed in his mind. "You have to trust people, Elliot. You have to trust that they won't hurt you." He had been afraid for so long. Afraid to trust, afraid to open up. But now, with Amara, he saw the power of those connections, the simple act of sharing your thoughts, your heart, with someone who cares. Lena watched the exchange with quiet pride. She had known her daughter's ability to make people see the world differently, but seeing it firsthand was something entirely new. It wasn't just about the drawings or the games, they were small gestures. The real magic was in Amara's ability to break through the walls people built around themselves and make them feel worthy of connection. Lena had seen this in her daughter before, but seeing it in someone like Elliot, someone so guarded, made her realize how much more her little girl had to offer than anyone could have imagined. As the evening came to a close, Elliot felt something in him settle, something that had been restless for years. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He didn't need to be the cold, unfeeling businessman who shut people out. He could be open. He could be honest. And that was enough. "Thank you," Elliot said quietly, looking at Amara, and then at Lena. "You've shown me something I didn't know I needed." Amara grinned, her eyes full of mischief. "I'm glad. But I think you already knew. You just had to remember." Elliot smiled, finally feeling at peace with the man he had become. He wasn't perfect, but he was real. And that was all that mattered. As Amara and Lena left, Elliot sat at the table, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but for the first time in a long time he wasn't afraid of what was to come. He had found something that no amount of wealth could buy. Real, meaningful connection. Elliot picked up the drawing of the two people walking together, and for the first time in years, he smiled. It was a genuine smile, a smile that came from deep within, from a place he had long forgotten. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was ready for it. With Amara's influence, with the lessons she had taught him, he knew that he could face whatever came his way, because for the first time, Elliot Rivers understood what it meant to truly live. If you enjoyed this story, let us know your favorite part of the story. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments, and if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit the subscribe button now.